So this video is going to be looking at Athens as leader of an empire. There are four main sources we'll be looking at, such as Aristotle, Athenian constitution, Plutarch, Pericles, Thucydides, a very long section of him, and the old oligarch. So you need to find that section in your source book. So the great thing about this particular topic is that it massively overlaps with the Peloponnesian War, as it is the same period. So any examples you want to use from the sources we looked at for the Peloponnesian War, so that's the first or the second Peloponnesian War, you can use in any question to do with this topic that comes up on section B. And you'll be an advantage for other students in the country because not everybody does this particular section. This does also mean that some of the examples we're going to look at in these sources will be the same ones that we looked at for the Peloponnesian War. So again, if you want to use any sources from section B, so this section, in the section A essay to do with the Persian or Peloponnesian War, you're more than welcome to, because it is the same time period and you are allowed to use additional sources if you want to. So with that little blurb over and done with, let's have a look then at this Aristotle source. So it's going to give you sort of a bit of a potted history about how Athens kind of changed under leadership and became this ruler of the empire. So we start at the beginning. So at the state, therefore, the state had advanced to this point, growing by slow stages in the growth of democracy. So that's also just about the setting up of the constitution under Solon and then Cleisthenes. But after the Persian War, the council of the Areopagus became powerful again and carried on the administration. Now, I've only really highlighted this because it's really useful for the participation and democracy section that we first started with on this particular part of the exam paper. So to be honest, it's not relevant to Athens as an empire, but it is a really useful quote to have, which is why I've highlighted it. And then it talks about sort of the Battle of Salamis, and the generals had grown sort of really worried about it. So there's some stuff about Salamis, sorry, if you want to use that, you can. But again, it's not particularly relevant for what we're talking about. And it talks about the role of the Areopagus. So in fact, I will highlight that for the same reason that it ties in with the participation and sort of how the democracy was working. So it talks about the council was basically paying people to man the ships. Fine. Then we're going to skip this little bit because it's not particularly relevant. And then we do have our two military leaders. So we've got Aristides and Themistocles. Both of these names should hopefully ring a bell. So Aristides was one of the key leaders during the end of the Persian War, going into the first Peloponnesian War. And then obviously Themistocles fought during the Persian War itself. So it's also, they were both really skillful in military, in politics, and the Athenians basically listened to them. So they'd rebuilt the walls, and although they didn't agree with each other, what we do have is beginning of this kind of Delian League empire stuff. So at the secession of the Ionian states from the Spartan alliance was promoted by Aristides. So he was going around and convincing different states to leave the Peloponnesian League and join the Delian League instead. So we can have this idea about imperialism and growth of the Delian League, who sees the opportunity when the Spartans were discredited because of Pausanias. So that should hopefully ring a bell, because Pausanias was the military leader of what was the Hellenic League at the time, and he really annoyed everybody by treating them all like Spartans. Hence, it was Aristides who assessed the tributes of the allied states on the first occasion. So here we have the beginning of the collection of tributes into the Delian League. If you remember back to the sources on the Peloponnesian War, also the interwar period, Aristides was called the Just, so he's the one who assessed the tribute really fairly, and the allies were quite happy with the level that he put in place for their tribute. And then we've got the idea that they could also, I'll highlight that, as part of control of the allies, that in order to sort of ratify the oath of joining the Delian League, they sent lumps of iron into the bottom of the sea. So basically they sort of block their ports, so the Athenians control the ports. So afterwards, now the state had been emboldened and much money had been collected. So obviously we've got the growth of imperialism. We could also use this, if you want to, in section 8 for effects of conflict, showing that Athens was benefiting from the Delian League, because they were obviously getting quite rich because they were collecting loads of money. So we're still talking about Aristides here. So he began to advise them to aim at the leadership, to come down from the farms and live in the city, telling them there'll be food for all. Some serving in the army and some as frontier guards, and others conducting the business of the community, and then by this method they would keep the leadership. So you could tie this into effects of conflict if you want to. Having taken this advice and won the empire, they treated the allies too masterfully. So there's a really good quote about the way the Athenians were treating the allies. They were also taking complete control and treating them quite badly, according to Aristotle. And I've highlighted in a different colour the exceptions to this. So except Chios, Lesbos and Samos, who have their own governments and rule their own subjects. So these guys were very independent and they could control themselves, although they were part of the Delian League. So we have evidence here showing that Athens were treating their allies unfairly, and we also have evidence that Athens was treating their allies fairly, which is often the two main arguments when we talk about Athens as the leader of an empire for this particular section. They establish a plentiful food supply for the multitude, as Aristides had proposed, for the combined proceeds of the tributes and the taxes and the allies served to feed more than 20,000 men. So again, we have a positive effect of conflict for Athens. They are benefiting from having this empire, which you could also put into the fact that they were using their allies as a source of wealth and resources, because obviously all the tributes paying feeding everybody in the city. There were 6,000 jurymen, 1,600 archers and 1,200 cavalry, 500 members of the council, 500 guardians of the docks, and 50 watchmen of the city. So these are all being paid for by the proceeds of the tribute. There's sort of 700 officials at home, as many as 700 abroad. And in addition to these, and later when they set into the war, 2,500 hoplites, 20 guard ships, and other ships conveying the guards to the number of 200 elected by lot, and so on and so forth. So all of these were being paid for by the tribute. So obviously Athens is benefiting hugely from the empire. Then we're going to look at a bit of Plutarch's Pericles. So this links into some sources we looked at for demagogues, and it's essentially going over the Megarian decree again and basically blaming Pericles for this. So they say that when an embassy had come from Sparta to Athens to treat of these matters, and Pericles was shielding himself behind the plea that a certain law prevented his taking down the tablet on which the decree was inscribed. Polylacles, I think. One of the ambassadors cried, "Well then, don't take it down, but turn the tablet to the wall. Sure, there's no law in preventing that." So this is kind of showing this misunderstanding between Sparta and Athens. Clever as the proposal was, however, not one whit more did Pericles give, as he doesn't give into it. He must have secretly cherished then, it seems, some private grudge against the Megarians. But by way of public and open charge, he accused them of appropriating to their own profane uses the sacred territory of Eleusis. So keeping in mind the causes of the Megarian decree, which is what this is talking about, so Plutarch suggests that Pericles just hated the Megarians, and he uses the excuse that they had basically misused some sacred land. Another reason given in another part of Plutarch, which I think is in your other section of the source book, was that it was over prostitutes, which obviously it wasn't. The real reason, remember, for the Megarian decree is to force Megara to rejoin the Delian League. They had left the Delian League and joined the Peloponnesian League in the interwar period. And obviously Athens was really unhappy about this, so they were hoping that by putting the Megarian decree and banning them from basically trading in any Athenian port, they would be basically starved into sort of submission. What we do have is obviously this really bad treatment of sort of an ally, which we can tie into this section. You could also use this within the demagogue section, because it shows that Pericles had the power to pass whatever legislation he wanted. But we must remember, as always, that the assembly was actually the ones who would have passed the Megarian decree. So Plutarch's blaming of Pericles completely is unfair, because he would have put forward the proposal, of course. He would have used, obviously, rhetoric to get it passed, but ultimately it was the assembly who passed it, not Pericles himself. Just keep in mind, of all the sources, they always put a blame on an individual, when in reality it goes through the assembly. Okay. So proposed decree that herald be sent to them, and sent also go to the Spartans, and a denunciation of the Megarians. This decree, at any rate, is the work of Pericles. So that reinforces what I've just said about Plutarch. Remember, that's not entirely true. And aims at a reasonable, humane justification of his course. But after the herald was sent, Athenomacritus, I think, having put to death through the mercy agency of the Megarians, it was believed. Sorry, I'm stumbling over my words today. Charonus proposed a decree against them to effect that there be irreconcilable and implacable enmity on the part of Athens towards them, and whosoever of the Megarians should set foot on the soil of Attica be punished with death. That's part of the Megarian decree, and that the generals, whenever they should take their ancestral oath of office, and oath to this clause, that they would invade the Megarians twice during each succeeding year. And then there's like this sort of bit of poetry that we don't need to worry about. So we're going to, I'm just reading it through. It's not poetry, it's from a play, but we don't need to worry about it. So that's obviously Pericles' fault, according to Plutarch, but as I said, it's really not. Now, another event that we looked at during Section A with the Peloponnesian War was the revolt of Mytilene. So, as a recap of what happened, Mytilene revolted from the Delian League, so they chose to leave. Athens had a vote in the assembly and voted to put to death everybody on the island. The next day they realised that they've been a little bit overzealous and held a second vote, and that vote overturned the first one. They sent a ship ahead to try and catch up with the ship they've already sent to kill everybody, and they basically ended up voting, sort of selling loads of people into slavery, but they didn't kill everybody. So this particular section of Thucydides is going to talk through that story, and it's going to be particularly useful for us looking at the power of demagogues, because Cleon's in this source. Obviously the treatment of Athenian allies, which again links into Section A, but obviously for this Section B. And we can also use it to show the power of rhetoric, which can be linked into, obviously, demagogues, but also into a later topic that we've not done yet, about sophists who taught rhetoric. It's quite a long source. I'm going to give you a heads up on this one, but it's relatively straightforward. It's remembering who speaks when. So we've got when Salamis and other prisoners reached Athens, the Athenians immediately put Salamis to death, in spite of the fact he undertook, amongst other things, to have the Peloponnesian withdraw from Plataea, which was being besieged. In fact, I'm going to highlight that. So one thing we always find really hard in Section A is to find examples of the Spartans treating any allies quite badly. What we can have is this one here, is that the Spartans were actually besieging Plataea. He was an ally, but sort of wasn't. They were officially allied to Athens, and Athens didn't help them. So we have the Spartans attacking another city-state and besieging them, basically starved them to death. It took like 3-4 years, and you got Athens not helping them. So that's quite handy for Section A. So I just thought I'd highlight that. They then discussed what was to be done with the other prisoners, and in their angry mood decided to put to death not only those in their hands, but also the entire adult male population of Mytilene, and to make slaves of the women and children. So there's our sort of unfair treatment of allies. What they held against Mytilene was the fact they had revolted, even though it was not a subject state. So although they were within the Delian League, they weren't as severely controlled as other states were. And the bitterness of the feeling was considerably increased by the fact that the Peloponnesian fleet had actually dared to cross over to Ionia to support the revolt, so the Spartans had helped them. This, it was thought, could never have happened unless the revolt had been premeditated, so it had been planned. So they sent a trireme to Pachus to inform him of what had decided, with orders to put the Mytilenes to death immediately. So they sent a boat to go and tell him what to do. Until, however, there was a sudden change of feeling, and people began to think how cruel and unprecedented such a decision was. So they realised, obviously, thing that is going, they've made the wrong decision, they need to sort of have another vote to destroy not only the guilty, but the entire population of the state, which, you know, is a fair point to raise. Observing this, the deputation of Mytilene was in Athens, and the Athenians who were supporting him approached the authorities with a view to having the question debated again. They won their point, the more easy because the authorities themselves saw clearly that most of the citizens were wanting someone to give them a chance of reconsidering the matter, so an assembly was called at once. Now, we can also use this source, this particular section, to do with the workings of the democracy, so about the different parts of the constitution. So you have evidence here of the assembly essentially doing its job. Yes, they vote to pass a law, they reconsider, there's going to be another vote. So we can show literally how the assembly was working. So you can use it for that in terms of showing that the people themselves had power over sort of demagogues. So we have an assembly is then called, and then we're going to have two people speaking. Cleon is the person who's going to speak first. So it was he who'd been responsible for passing of the original motion for putting the Mytilenes to death. And then there's a bit of criticism from Thucydides because he doesn't like Cleon. He was remarkable for the Athenians who put the violence of his character. Importantly for us, for quote for demagogues, at this time he exercised far the greatest influence over the people. So demagogue power completely. So now Cleon is going to give his speech about what to do with the Mytilenes, and he's going to give over a variety of different arguments about why they should do what they should do. So this is all really good for rhetoric and the power of demagogues. Personally, I've occasion enough already to observe that democracy is incapable of governing others. I am all in the more convinced of this when I see how you're now changing your minds about the Mytilenes. So he's obviously criticising the democracy, so you can point that out if you want to highlight it, sorry. Because fear and conspiracy play no part in your daily reasons with each other, you imagine the same rule is true of your allies. You fail to see that when you allow them to persuade you to make a mistaken decision, and when you give away your own feelings of compassion, you are guilty of a kind of weakness that is dangerous to you and will not make them love you anymore. So that's his main argument, that if you make this decision, you're going to basically undermine the empire. When you do not realise that your empire is a tyranny exercised over subjects who do not like it, which is a fantastic quote to show Athens as leader of the empire in terms of not treating their allies fairly. I mean, Cleon just lays it on the line there and just says, yeah, you're a tyranny and people don't like it. And who are always plotting against you. In fact, we'll highlight that as well, because it does show that obviously the allies were unhappy with the way Athens was ruling them, so that's why there's lots of revolts. You will not make them obey you by injuring your own interests in order to do them a favour. Your leadership depends on superior strength, so you need to use the allies to make yourself strong to make sure you can control them, and not on any goodwill of theirs. This is the very worst thing, to pass measures and not abide by them. I'm not entirely sure that's true, Cleon, but that's fine. We should realise that the city is better off with bad laws so long as they remain fixed than with good laws that are constantly being altered. Now, if you put into context of what's been happening with the A-levels this year, I think we could all disagree, I should say 2020 for future years, that's not true, that a bad law should stay in place just because it's really bad to fix a law. Anyway, that lack of learning combined with sound common sense is more helpful than the kind of cleverness that gets out of hand, that as a general rule states are better governed by the man in the street than by intellectuals. So you could suggest here, where I've lost my place, there we go, that the power of the democracy in the hands of the people is better. So that's the power of the mob, you could suggest, as an evidence in terms of participation. These are the sorts of people who want to appear wiser than the laws, who want to get their own way in every general discussion, because they feel they cannot show off their intelligence in matters of greater importance, who, as a result, very often bring ruin on their country. So he's basically criticising the rich. But the other kind, the people who are not so confident in their own intelligence, are prepared to admit that the laws are wiser than they are, and they lack the ability to pull pieces a speech made by a good speaker. So we've got power of rhetoric here. So he's pointing out that if you have a speaker who is very good at rhetoric, they can sort of confuse people, and people are aware that they may not understand the speech properly. They are unbiased judges and not people taking part in some kind of competition, so things usually go well when they are in control. We statesmen too should try to be like them, instead of being carried away by mere cleverness and desire to show off our intelligence, so giving you the people advice which we do not really believe in ourselves. So that's basically about rhetoric, use of rhetoric to control people. As for me, I have not altered my opinion. There's a shocker. I am amazed by those who propose the reconsidering of the question of Mytilene, thus causing a delay which is all to the advantage of the guilty party. After a lapse of time, the injured party will lose the edge of his anger when he comes to act against those who have wronged him, whereas the best punishment are the ones fitted to the crime when reprisals follow immediately. So I don't think, just act. I should be amazed too if anyone contradicts me and attempts to prove that the harm done to us by Mytilene is really a good thing for us, or that when we suffer ourselves we are somehow doing harm to our allies. So I obviously highlighted that about sort of treatment of allies. It is obvious that anyone who's going to say this must either have such confidence in his powers as an orator that he will struggle to persuade you that what has been finally settled was, on the contrary, not decided at all, or else he must have been bribed to put together some elaborate speech. So we could have here evidence in terms of participation about corruption, perhaps, in the Athenian democracy, and he's also suggesting that whoever wants to argue against him is just doing it because he's being paid to do so. With which he will try to lead you out of the right track. But in competitions of the sort, the prizes go to others and the state takes all the danger for herself. The blame is yours for stupidly instituting these competitive displays. You have become regular speech goers. So this is all about rhetoric, this last section. So he is criticising, somewhat ironically, the people for listening to rhetoric and not thinking for themselves. So everything I've highlighted is to do with rhetoric. So this can be used either for demagogues, It could also be used for sophists. It could also be used about participation and sort of maybe that people weren't really in control of the democracy. As for action, you merely listen to accounts of it. If something to be done in the future, estimate possibilities by hearing good speech on the subject. And as for the past, you rely not so much on the facts which you've seen with your own eyes, as on what you have heard about them in some clever piece of verbal criticism. So, again, rhetoric is too persuasive. Any novelty in an argument deceives you at once. It's pretty obvious what you're stating there. When the argument is tried and proved, you become unwilling to follow it. You look with suspicion what is normal, and are slaves of every paradox that comes your way. The chief wish of each one of you, is to be able to make a speech himself, and if you cannot do that, the next best thing is to compete with those who can make this sort of speech by not looking as though you were all out of your depth while you listen to the views put forward, by applauding a good point even before it is made, and by being as quick as seeing how an argument is going to be developed as you are in slow and understanding what the end it will lead to. So these are all criticisms of the use of rhetoric to persuade people, which I said is somewhat ironic, considering that's obviously what Cleon is doing right now, using rhetoric to convince people. What you're looking for all the time is something that, I should say, outside the range of ordinary experience, and yet you cannot even think straight about the facts of life that are before you. You are simply victims of your own pleasure in listening, and are more like an audience sitting at the feet of a professional lecturer than a parliament discussing matters of state. So I think I will highlight that as well, because again, he's criticising the Athenian democracy. I am trying to stop you behaving like this. I say no single city has ever done you the harm that Mytilene has done. I'm not sure that's true. Personally, I can make allowances for those who revolt because they find your rule intolerable. So there's a really good quote here for the nature of Athenian leadership over the League, because they have been forced into it by enemy action. Here, however, we have the case of people living on an island behind their own fortifications, with nothing to fear from our enemies except an attack by sea, against which they are adequately protected by their own force of triremes. So you're saying, basically, Mytilene had no reason to revolt. They were protected. We weren't controlling them and they had their own independent government. They could do whatever they really wanted. So how dare they revolt? Now to act as they acted is not what I call revolt, for people only revolt when they've been badly treated. It is a case of calculated aggression. So he's saying, Mytilene had no reason to revolt, so we shouldn't even call it a revolt. It's just they were deliberately doing it in order to try and sort of undermine the League, and deliberately taking sides of our British enemies in order to destroy us. This is far worse than if they made war against us simply to increase their own power. They learned nothing from the fate of those neighbours who had already revolted and been subdued. So again, we have bad treatment of allies here. We got allies who were revolting and being forced back into the League. So if we think back to Section A, he's sort of making reference to places like Naxos and Thassos and Samos. There's loads of them, all the osses together. So we can link that back into that as well. There's prosperity which they enjoyed did not make them hesitate before running into danger. Confident in the future, they declared war on us, with hopes both extended beyond their means, though still fell short of their desires. They made up their minds to make first and right second, choosing the moment they thought they would win, and were making their own unprovoked attack upon us. So I would suggest that Cleon's a little bit in denial about why these allies are revolting. It's Mytilene just want to leave. They want to undermine, take our power. Pretty sense because they were unhappy in the League. The fact is that when great prosperity comes suddenly and unexpectedly to a state, it usually breeds arrogance. In most cases, it is safe for people to enjoy an average amount of success rather than something which is all out of proportion, and it is easier, I should say, to ward off hardship, than to maintain happiness. What we should have done long ago with the Mytilenes was to treat them in exactly the way as all the rest. So he's suggesting they should have been horrible to the Mytilenes, like way worse than what the Athenians suggest they were acting as. So again, we've got a nice example of the treatment of allies here. Then they would never grow into arrogance, because you would have, treated them so badly, they would have no arrogance left. For it is a general rule of human nature that people despise those who treat them well and look up to those who make no concessions. I don't agree with Cleon on that point. It's an interesting argument. So you hate people who look after you. Okay. Let them now, therefore, have the punishment for which their crime deserves. So I'll highlight that as well. So they should be treated really badly, which is, again, treatment of allies, i.e. kill everybody. Do not put the blame on the aristocracy and say that people were innocent. The fact is, the whole lot of them, they attacked you together. although the people may have come over to us, and if they had, would now be back in control of the city, yet instead of doing this, they thought it safer to share the dangers and join the revolt of the aristocracy. Now think of your allies. If you're going to give them the same punishment to those who are forced to revolt by your enemies and those who do so of their own accord, can you not see they will all revolt upon the slightest pretext, when success means freedom and failure means no dreadful consequences? So he's sort of suggesting that all the allies should be treated really horrifically to keep them under control, which again links into the treatment of allies. Meanwhile, we shall have to spend our money and risk our lives against state after state. If all our efforts are successful, we shall recover a city that is in ruins, and so lose the future revenue from it. They'd lose tribute if they had to go around attacking everybody all the time, on which our strength is based. So we can have that in terms of why they have an empire. It's for wealth and resources. If we fail to subdue it, we shall have more enemies to deal with in addition to those we have already, and we shall spend the time we ought to be sued in resisting our present woes in making war on our own allies. He is nearly done with the speech. Let there be no hope, therefore, held up to Mytilenes that we, either as a result of a good speech or a large bribe, we will highlight again for rhetoric and corruption, are likely to forgive them on the grounds that it is only human to make mistakes. There was nothing involuntary about the harm they did to us. They knew what they were about, and they planned it all beforehand. And only one forgives actions that were not deliberate. As for me, just as I was at first, so I am now, and I shall continue to impress on you the importance of not altering your previous decisions. To feel pity, to be carried off by the pleasure of hearing clever arguments, rhetoric again. To listen to the claims of decency are three things that are entirely without the interests of being of an imperial power. So there's a nice quote about imperialism, which obviously Athens had. Do not be guilty of them. As for compassion, it is proper to feel it in the case of people who are like ourselves, who will pity us in their turn, not in the case of those who, so far from having the same feelings towards us, must always inevitably be our enemies. As for the speech makers who give such pleasure by their arguments, again a quote for rhetoric, they should hold their competitions on subjects which are less important, and not on a question where state may have to pay a heavy penalty for its light pleasure, while the speakers themselves will no doubt be enjoying splendid rewards for their splendid arguments, and a sense of decency is only felt towards those who are going to be our friends in future, not towards those who remain just as they were, and as much as as they could have been, as they ever have been, just changing his words now. Let me sum up the whole thing. I say that, if you follow my advice, you will be doing the right thing as far as Mytilene is concerned, and at the same time will be acting in your own interests. If you decide differently, you will not win them over, but you'll be passing judgment on yourselves. For if they were justified in revolting, you must be wrong in holding power. So obviously pointing out that if you consider it a revolt, then Athens has been treated really badly, when actually, according to Cleon, they've been treating Mytilenes really fairly. If, however, whatever the rights or wrongs of it may be, you propose to hold all the power all the same, then your interest demands that these two, rightly or wrongly, must be punished. The only alternative is to surrender your empire. So there's a really nice quote about imperialism. So you can only afford to go in for, I can never say that word, philanthropy. There we go. Make up your minds, therefore, to pay them back in their own coin. Do not make it look as though you had escaped their manumissions, are less quick to react than when they started them. Remember how they would have been likely to have treated you if they had won, especially as they were the aggressors. Those who do wrong to a neighbour when there is no reason to do so are the ones who persevere to the point of destroying him, since they see the danger involving allowing their enemy to survive. For he who has suffered for no good reason is more a dangerous enemy if he escapes than the one who's done both and suffered injury. So just kill them all. It's basically the argument. So Cleon speaks, and then we have the counter-argument. So we have Diodotus, who we will never hear ever again after this, but he gives the opposite argument, which is a bit shorter than what Cleon put forward. You notice the numbers, we're nearly there. I do not blame those who propose a new debate on the subject of Mytilene, and I do not share the view that we have heard expressed, that it's a bad thing to have frequent discussions on matters of importance. Haste and anger, to my mind, are the two greatest obstacles to wise counsel, which I personally agree with him on here. If you act out of anger, you tend to do the wrong thing. It's what he's basically suggesting. Haste, which usually goes with folly, Anger, that is the mark of primitive and narrow minds. And anyone who maintains words cannot be a guide to action must either be a fool or one with some personal interest at stake. He is a fool if he imagines that it is possible to deal with the uncertainties of the future by any other medium, and he is personally interested if his aim is to persuade you of some disgraceful actions. I know that he cannot make a good speech in a bad cause. He tries to frighten his opponents and his hearers by some good-sized pieces of misrepresentation. So again, we have a bit about demagogues and rhetoric. So he's basically saying Cleon is deliberately making you scared, and he's playing to your fears, and he is lying to you. Then, still more intolerable are those who go further and accuse the speaker of making some kind of exhibition of himself because he's paid for it. So he's saying, you can't accuse these people of corruption, it's not right. So he's obviously criticising Cleon's argument here. If it was only ignorance with which he was being charged, a speaker who failed to win his case could retire from the debate and still be thought of an honest man, if not a very intelligent one. But when corruption is imputed, he will be suspect if he wins the case, and if he loses, will be regarded as dishonest and stupid at the same time. This sort of thing does the city no good. The councillors will be afraid to speak and will be deprived of their services. So he's also suggesting, if you're sort of criticising speech makers, then you're actually undermining the democracy, because that's clearly a key part of how the democracy worked. It's people turning up to the assembly. Because remember, in the assembly, anybody has the right to speak who was attending. So he's saying, if you're accusing these people of corruption just because you don't agree with them, you're basically undermining the democracy. I've now lost my place. Although certainly it would be a good, best possible thing for the city if these gentlemen whom I have been describing lack the power to express themselves, we should not then be persuaded into making so many mistakes. The good citizen instead of trying to terrify the opposition, so if we can have that as a criticism of demagogues and their use of rhetoric, particularly Cleon, ought to prove his case in fair argument, and a wise state without giving special honours to its best counsellors will certainly not deprive them of the honour they already enjoy. And when a man's advice is not taken, he should be disgraced, far less penalised. In this way, the successful speakers will be less likely to pursue further honours by speaking against their own convictions in order to make themselves popular. So we could have the idea that rhetoric is being used, I like that as well, to sort of gain political power, perhaps. And unsuccessful speakers will not struggle to win over people by the same acts of flattery. So again, about rhetoric. There's loads of rhetoric in this source. It's really, really helpful. What we do here, however, is exactly the opposite. So then too, if a man gives the best possible advice, but is under the slightest suspicion of being influenced by his own private profit, we are so embittered by the idea, a wholly unproved one, of this profit of his, that we do not allow the state to receive the certain benefit of his good advice. So a state of affairs has been reached where a good proposal honestly put forward, put forward is just a suspect of something bad. The result is just as the speaker who advocates some monstrous measure has to win over the people by deceiving them. So again, it's about rhetoric. I'm going to skip the rest of this particular bit because I'm conscious of how long this video is turning out to be. But essentially, he's still talking about if you sort of criticise one side or support one side, you're going to undermine the democracy. And again, he says, I'm not trying to sort of support Mussolini in terms of just to be contradictory. He's trying to prove that if we pose a death penalty, it's really basically against interests of the Athenians. So in our view, discussion concerns the future rather than the present. One of Cleon's chief points is that to inflict the death penalty be useful to us in the future as means of deterring other citizens from revolts. You've got treatment of allies. And he's basically saying, as convinced as he is about this, I don't think it's true. You may find his speech attractive, so we could have that again as rhetoric because it fits better with your present angry feelings. So I'll highlight that whole thing. So the idea that obviously Cleon as a demagogue is playing into people's feelings and using that in order to get his way. And he's sort of saying, this is a political assembly, it's not a law court, and we can't act this way because it's really unjustified. This whole section here, which I've not highlighted really, as you can tell, is basically pointing out why you should not be using the death penalty in this case. So he's sort of saying, when you use the death penalty in less serious ones, it doesn't stop people committing crimes. And there's no law that will prevent people from acting badly because people always act badly despite the laws being in place, which is a fair point to argue. So using this kind of fear is not going to work because it will just make people rebel anyway. Just skim reading it as well. So then he's saying, if you then use the death penalty, you might actually embolden people even further because they have nothing to lose. Because, if they win, then obviously they'll be free, and if they die, they'll be killed, so they'll try even harder. It's basically the thread of his argument. And then it kind of comes back in a little bit more relevancy for us. We must not come to the wrong conclusions by having too much confidence in the effectiveness of capital punishments. We must not make the condition of rebels desperate by depriving them of the possibility of repentance and a chance of atoning quickly as what they did. So that's the point I was making up here, that he's basically saying, if a city revolts and can't succeed, and hang on, I'll skip that sentence for a second. If we basically kill everybody, they'll take more careful preparation for revolt, and they'll keep sieging, which costs us even more. When actually, if we just treated them a little bit more kindly, in terms of not killing everybody, we could deal with it much quicker. What we can have in terms here, this is quite a useful quote about wealth and resources, so that's why I wanted to skip that for a second. And he's saying if they keep besieging, what we end up is we take over the city eventually, that's massively in ruins, and we actually lose the revenue. So again, we've got the idea that the allies are being used as a source of wealth and resources here. So our business, therefore, is not to injure ourselves by acting like a judge who strictly examines a criminal. So we're looking for a method by which, employing moderation in our punishments, we can see the future, secure ourselves the full use of these cities. I'll just highlight that. So again, about wealth and resources, which bring us important contributions. In fact, I will highlight that as well. There we go. And we should recognise that the proper basis of our security is in good administration rather than the fear of legal penalties. When we subdue a free city, which has been held down by force, we expect, so if we punish them really badly, we're undermining basically our ability to use them later on as a source of revenue. Consider what mistake you have making this very point. If you took Cleon's advice, as things now in all cities, democracy is friendly to you, does not join in with the oligarchies in revolting. So we've got evidence here maybe of a little bit of the idea that Athens was promoting democracies over oligarchies, which is really useful for section A in terms of causes of conflict. If you destroy the Democratic Party in Mytilene, never took part in the revolt, you'll be doing exactly what the reactionary classes want the most. So you're playing into their hands. So we shouldn't kill them because we're actually punishing innocent people. So he then points out that this is my main argument, please accept my point. I've not played on your emotions. I've basically been quite logical, and we should sort of act wisely for the future and not sort of make more enemies as we sort of react in this way. They give the speech is given across, his Diodotus passes, they send out another boat to catch up with the other boats, and then we have some effects of conflict here. So the Mytilenes who were in Athens are killed. They destroy the fortifications of Mytilene and take their navy. So we've got Athens gaining resources, but obviously we've got treatment of allies about the fortifications being destroyed. They divide the land, and they basically sell it to some Athenians, and they also rent it out to people left in the area. So then we've got the Mytilenes become subject of Athens. So again, we've got treatment of allies here, which is quite useful quotes. So that is the end of that really long section of Thucydides. We also have a sort of lengthy-ish, I'm just scrolling down, lengthy-ish bit of the old oligarch. So this came out from the middle section of the bit that we looked at for about participation, and it talks about the allies, and it's quite generic ally stuff, which is really helpful for us. So on the subject of the allies, it is well known that the Athenians sail out and bring false charges against respectable elements amongst them and hate them. So basically talking about oligarchies. So they are undermining oligarchies and imposing democracies, which is useful for causes of conflict about sort of oligarchy versus democracy. But also you could use that about treatment of allies, about forcing different political systems on them. Because they realise that rule is always the subject. If the rich and powerful come to power in the allied cities, the emperor of the common people of Athens will only last a short time. So basically democracy would play into Athenian hands better. This is why they deprive the respectable elements of their citizen rights, take away their money, drive them into exile, and kill them while increasing the power of the mob. So they are obviously promoting democracies. Taking away their money, you could suggest, is the wealth and resources point as well. The respectable elements in Athens try to protect the respectable elements in the allied cities because they recognise it is in their own interest to protect the aristocracies in these states. Some people may think that if the allies are able to contribute money, this would strengthen the power of the Athenians. That's pretty self-explanatory. But the common people think it preferable that each individual Athenian should possess allied money, and the allies should keep just enough to live and work on without being able to plot against them. So you can use that quote either to show unfair treatment, because obviously, essentially, they're taking all the money from the allies and leaving them just enough. We can also use it sort of to show fair treatment, because they are being left enough money to keep them vaguely happy. I think it depends how you look at it. Again, people think that the Athenians are wrong to compel the allies to sail to Athens for justice. So again, we've got the control of the allies. In reply, the Athenians enumerate all the benefits accruing to the common people from this practice. First of all, the allies' legal deposits provide them enough money to pay the jurymen each year. So again, we've got use of wealth and resources. They can control the allied cities without control, leaving them home, going on a sea voyage. They can make use of the law courts to protect those who belong to the common people and ruin their opponents. Again, treatment of allies. Whereas if each of the allied states had its own courts, they should show dislike of Athens by ruining those of their own number, see particularly well. Blah, 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 blah. Furthermore, the common people of Athens derive the following benefits from the fact the allies are tried in Athens. So we have a tax, so 1% duty levied at the Piraeus brings in more revenue, and they can also charge people for staying. The heralds make money for the allies coming to use the law courts, and basically he's repeating himself quite a lot in here. What we can have is like the Athenians' ally slavery, nice short simple quote about treatment of allies, and we have furthermore, because of their overseas possession and the public offices which taken them overseas, the Athenians in attendance have learnt how to row almost without realising it, so they have like a strong navy as a result of having allies abroad, I guess is his point, for which a man often travels by sea. He and his servant are bound to take an oar and learn the names of things concerned with seamanship. Their experience in ships and practice make them good steersmen, so the navy is strong as a result of it. I'm not quite sure where you could put that, but it's quite a useful quote, I suppose. And that just repeats the same point, as the old oligarch often does. So again, we're talking about the benefits the allies bring them. So you've got the allies who pay tribute. They are strongest by land as well by sea because of the tributes. They have a really strong army. You could use this in terms of like military power, I guess, for Section A, perhaps. Again, we've got all those islands who are subject to a sea power cannot unite their cities. So this part of old oligarch, now I remember what he's going on about, it's basically saying why it's really good that Athens has chosen to control islands instead of the mainland. And part of it is because the allies can't basically club together to rebel very easily against the Athenians. The Athenians always have like an upper hand because they control the sea, because they're really good at sailing, which is true. And again, for no city without exports and imports, but you're not permitted to trade unless it submits to the rules of the sea. So that's basically Athens control the sea and controls the trade within it, and that's why they're so powerful. Again, he points out those who rule a naval empire can sail as far as they like from their own country, which is true, but those who rule a land empire cannot travel many days from home, so it's easier to travel if you have a naval power than it is, like say Sparta, trying to conquer places, because they're always marching everywhere, because it's really slow, which is what this bit, and obviously you've got boats, it's quicker, and sea powers have supplies brought in from unaffected areas. So if Athens was, in fact, we'll use this example as the plague. When there is the plague, they were able to import food still through the port, and that's why they were able to kind of lock themselves away. And also during the raids on Attica, that's why Athens was able to sort of survive them for so long, because they had the port, because the port was within the long walls. And it talks about here that they get really nice food, which is lovely, and they have lots of languages. And then the Athenians basically are the only people who possess the wealth that comes from trading overseas. So again, they're benefiting from the empire. They can get like really good timber. They can get copper. They get it from all over the place and have competition and they don't have to pay the highest price, is what this is talking about. The Athenians will not allow the competitors to take produce elsewhere, so they're controlling their allies. Still talking about flax, which I think is some kind of like material. And then he's talking about here, essentially, I'll just read it. So again, it's about the benefits of having a naval empire, because even if they lived on an island, they could still control the waters and not have any harm. And he's making this point basically the same way several different times. So if they're on an island still, they're going to be safe. And that's essentially it. Oligarchus is basically saying Athens is really powerful because they're a naval power, which he's probably right about. Right, so hopefully you can see how these sources can be used in Section A as well as Section B, and also get you thinking about some of those examples from the Peloponnesian War that can be used within Section B to show Athens controlling their allies. For example, Naxos, Thasos and Samos. You could talk about Melos. You can talk about any place where Athens basically attacked them or treated them fairly.